feels like to me that we're coming out of a long and dark tunnel that we have been in for a long time. And now we're coming out into the fresh air and the sunlight. The question is, are we just going to be in the sunlight for a few moments and then enter into a different but equally long and equally dark tunnel? Or will we do something about the society in which we find ourselves living today? We just had an election, and it does appear that the American people are very much ready for a new direction. We're ready to abandon these faulty standards that we've been living under this last several years, these man-made standards that are ever-changing, and they always seem to be a standard or a rule that's made to give somebody else an advantage over the rest of the people. What kind of standards will we adopt now? Will we let our new leadership just come in and set whatever rules and standards they want to set? Will we live in that way? You see, this nation, the United States of America, was set up by people who very much believed in God and who very much believed that Jesus was his son and who very much believed that the Bible was their word and that it contained standards that had to be lived by. It's true that we had some notable people who, while they may not have been atheists, they certainly were more along the lines of deists or religionists who didn't have the same strong religious beliefs that other people did. But for the most part, and especially when you looked at the very top of our leadership, we had people who were very much devoted to God and to his way, and they tried to weave that into the Constitution that they drafted in order that we would have righteous standards for a nation that wouldn't change. And the reason that they wouldn't change is because they were time-tested standards that weren't developed by men, but which were developed by God. And they had hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of success. And this is what they wanted to found America on. And America ran very well under these sets of standards. But then we started changing them and getting away from them. There's a similar time. It was the time when the Mosaic law was being developed. Moses had received laws from God on Mount Sinai, and he passed them along to the people. And just before Moses died, he said this. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 8. And he said, "What other nation is as great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws that I'm setting before you today?" You see, he was pointing out that these laws that were given by God would make them great as a people. And it did for hundreds of years, but there came a point where the people got away from God's rules and God's laws and God's standards, and they started setting up standards of their own. By the time we get to the book of Judges, you begin to read a series of stories that are almost incomprehensible to us today. The perverse activity that was going on, it's almost confusing to think that these could be God's people. But at the end of Judges, it explains how they had become so debased and so immoral and so foreign from God's standards. And it said this, "In those days, Israel had no king, and every man did as he saw fit." Everyone was just doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. And it wasn't that a king would have made them so great, but the king was to uphold God's standards. And when they had rejected God's standards, they rejected everything else. And so they just started doing their own thing. And they began to live in a moral chaos and a moral anarchy that eventually left them enslaved in many parts of Israel. Well, we have been in a similar time where people have abandoned God's ways and have tried their own ways. How has that worked? Well, the majority of Americans have decided we don't want to live that way anymore. We want to abandon these politically correct and these woke standards that we've been living under and go to a new set of standards. But what standards will it be? Will we let this new leadership just choose standards of their own making? Or will we demand a return to God's standards? You see, it needs to be Christians who are instrumental in setting these standards. In Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus was speaking and the Sermon on the Mount was being recorded, he just said this, "You're the light of the world. Let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." You see, when we're living for God in God's ways, it really does become a light. And it's something that is readily identifiable by people as something that is good and that they want as well. And Jesus was just telling the people, essentially, if you want to follow God, then you're going to have to follow his ways. And by doing so, you need to let those ways be visible. Not so that men can praise you, but so that men can praise God. And we can only do that if we go by God's standards. It's really important that we understand this, this principle. It's found in Acts chapter 4 and verse 12. And it simply says, salvation is found in no one else, talking about Jesus. For there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. You see, Christ, following him and following his ways is the only way to salvation. Not only for eternal salvation, but I believe you will find that by following Christian principles, just like our founders found, that we can restore the nation. We can save it from the reckless path that we've been on. A path that has just been causing us to sink lower and lower, not only in the esteem of the rest of the world, but in our own eyes as well. We have an opportunity to have a new set of standards. And again, I want to say that Christians need to take part in this. We need to be vocal in this. We need to be praying for this. I'm not talking about setting up a theocracy, but I am saying that you set God's standards before you in your own life and you live by them and you encourage others to do the same. People at the highest levels of power within our nation to do the same. Because if we can restore godly principles and godly standards to this nation, and if we can start following those standards again, these standards that, by the way, do not change like the standards of men do, but if we can do that and come back to these godly principles, I believe you'll find that America will be a great nation once again. But absent that, if we decide we're just going to go by our own set of standards, if we're going to use this change as an opportunity to gain revenge upon all of our enemies and use these new opportunities as a motive of enriching ourselves with the new standards, then we're going to fail just as miserably as those who had employed the old set of standards. What standard will America seek right now? As a matter of fact, what God will America seek? Will we seek the only true God, the Creator, and his Son and their ways? Or will we seek after the idols of this world? If we can restore God's standards, I want to say once again, we'll restore America's greatness. And our children and our grandchildren and all the subsequent generations are going to benefit from that. But if we don't, well, I'm afraid we're just going to go right back into another tunnel. It may be a new one, but it's going to be just as long and just as dark. The choice is ours. Will we do our part? Something to think about, isn't it? Well, thank you for listening today. I hope we'll see you next time.